Senator Marco Rubio is going to be here to talk about his immigration plan. He's a part of this so-called Gang of Eight that has come up with a proposal, a compromise on comprehensive immigration reform. And let me give you some background of where I stand on this, putting my cards on the table. I'm in favor of immigration reform. I think that the current status quo is unworkable, it's broken, it's dysfunctional, and at almost every level, it's unfair. It's unfair to citizens. It's unfair to people who worked really hard to get here legally. And at times, it's also unfair to people who came here illegally. It needs to be changed. And I entirely agree with Senator Rubio's contention that the status quo, staying as we are, amounts to a de facto amnesty for millions of people. It's a mess. He makes that point. It's valid. Let me also say this. I am a huge fan of Marco Rubio. Ever since I saw him give his farewell speech on the floor of the House in Florida when he was going to run for Senate against very long odds, ended up beating Charlie Crist, of course, and became the U.S. Senator, I was smitten politically when I saw that speech. He's a natural. He's hugely talented. He's likable. He's conservative. I admire him. I respect him. I trust him. All that being said, in spite of my open-mindedness, if not appetite, for reform, and my positive feelings towards Senator Rubio, I have some real, serious, substantive issues with what I've seen so far coming out of the Gang of Eight. As I've looked at the bill, as I've read analysis of it, as I've peered under the hood. And so Senator Rubio will be joining us in just a moment. Unfortunately, we're only going to have about 7 minutes with him because he was squeezed between interviews and our time together got pretty much chopped in half. So I am going to try to jam as many questions in that short period of time as possible. And then I'll let you know what some of my additional questions were that we didn't get to. And hopefully we'll have another round of this at some point with the senator. And so without further ado, we're delighted to be joined by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right into the questions.
Yep.
As a conservative senator, I guess a big picture question I have is, we as conservatives really have a lot of skepticism about the federal government. There's a Pew poll that came out this week. Confidence in the federal government is at an all-time low across all demographics, especially among Republicans. And there's good reason for this, be it Obamacare or the stimulus. The government has shown an inability, an incompetence at doing big things. So why should we trust the federal government to get this right finally after decades of missing the mark?
Well, first of all, that's a great question, and that's exactly why I've gotten involved in it. The only way that I know to make the executive branch execute a law is to pass a law that forces them to do it. So, for example, one of the things we've known for a long time is that the magnet that draws illegal immigrants to the United States is employment. And this law mandates a universal E-Verify system. It is not an option. It is a mandate. They must do it. We know that 40% of the people that are illegally in this country entered legally and overstayed their visas. This law mandates the creation of an entry and exit system so we can track everyone, not just when they come in, but when they leave. It also mandates spending over $5.5 billion on border security, including $1.5 billion on new fencing, double fencing, not chicken wire, real stuff. So these are mandated things that will have to happen. And in addition to that, it fundamentally changes the legal immigration system away from this kind of family-based system that is based totally on whether you know someone who lives here or not, to a system that's based on whether you have the talents and the skills to contribute to our economy. The alternative to doing that, I think, unfortunately, given the political makeup of the country, is to leave things the way they are and leave them in place. And the way they are in place right now is an administration that is never going to do E-Verify, is never going to secure the border, and is never going to do any of these things that we're talking about doing. So,
okay, well, speaking of that administration, Janet Napolitano's DHS secretary, a lot of the law here, a lot of the triggers and the enforcement is ceded to the Department of Homeland Security, at least up front. Napolitano just last month said that the border's already secure. So, why should we entrust this DHS and this secretary in particular to do a job that she thinks is already done?
Well, first of all, we don't, because she'll only be secretary under the best-case scenario for another 3 years. This law doesn't even get to the first trigger point until year 5. Let me say, E-Verify is not a discretionary thing. It must be done. Entry-exit in this bill is not discretionary. It must be done. The only thing that they get a chance to do is this border stuff. They have to come up with a plan to secure the border and a plan for the fencing. And then in 5 years, that means 2 years after she's long gone, if they are not apprehending 90% of the people that are crossing the border, then an additional $2 billion will be spent on border security. This is long after they're gone away. And so, while obviously there are always going to be consequences to having the wrong people in government, but the good news is the wrong people that are there now will not be there forever. And this bill doesn't even begin to award green cards, and I mean not even award green cards, but allow people to apply for green cards until year 11, until the beginning of year 11, long after they're gone.
Right. So the beginning of that process to provisional legal status requires sort of a two-pronged trigger, as you call it, involving DHS creating these two plans for border security and the fence. I just struggle to really look at that as a legitimate, meaningful trigger, because putting stuff on paper, unless it's the Democrats and a budget, is something that people can do in Washington pretty easily. How is that a meaningful trigger?
Well, I would just say to you that if there's a way to improve it, we should do it. And my challenge to my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee and the conservatives involved in this debate is to offer a better way. And let's build on what we've offered. I've never said that our bill is a take-it-or-leave-it offer. I've said it's a starting point. And if there is a better way, I'm open to it. I encourage it. And I've talked about that and continue to say that. I can tell you that the only way we're ever going to force this to happen is to pass a law that forces it to happen. And so if there's a better way to make that happen, I want to do it. And I encourage, and I'm constantly encouraging and talking to my colleagues about ways to do it. I'm actively engaged and meeting with each of my Senate colleagues in the Republican Party here on a way to improve our ideas. And if we can do that, I think we should do that.
Senator, the commission, if DHS fails, if the triggers or the standards aren't met, there's a commission that gets put in place. That's like the biggest punchline in the book in terms of Washington putting together a commission and nothing really ever comes of it. What enforcement mechanism is there? Why is this commission suddenly going to work?
Well, first of all, the commission exists at the front end as an advisory group that it will comment on the stuff that DHS is already doing. Where the commission comes into vigor is if after 5 years, after they've done these two plans that you outlined at the beginning, the border plan, the fence plan,
right.
If after the 5 years we are not apprehending 90% of the people crossing the border, then the commission is giving $2 billion to put in place an additional plan to try to reach that goal. The commission is made up of appointees here in Congress, but it also has the 4 border state governors, and these are not wilting willows. I mean, these are significant public figures who are directly impacted from the border. The governors of Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, and they're going to have their imprint on this as well. So what the commission does is it creates an additional plan on the border and spends an additional $2 billion to get the border secure. But again, as I repeat to people, if someone has a better way to do this, I want them to offer it. I'm open to that. I'll be supportive of that. And as I've always said about the bill, it's a starting point. It's not a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. I think we all share the goal of securing the border, and I hope that through this process we can come up with a better way to do it.
All right, Senator, last question. I know you've got to run. These are just sort of technical questions. Part of it is there's a cutoff. People who have gotten to the country illegally after December 31st, 2011, are not eligible for this provisional status. And then they also have to pay some back taxes, the people who are eligible. How does the government determine when someone got here and what taxes they owe if they've been doing it in the shadows and illegally?
Okay, first of all, the burden to prove they've been here is on them. So if they can't prove it, they can't stay, and it's not our fault. Obviously, there's multiple factors that you use: bank statements, utilities, school records, medical records. These folks that are here illegally do leave a paper trail, even though we don't do anything about it. So, again, the burden is on them to prove. And I would just say the less documentation they have, the less likely they're telling the truth about it. And I think that's important. And let me just tell you why it's important to have a cutoff date in the past. And that's because otherwise everyone will claim, people will rush the border and try to beat the deadline. So I think that's an important provision in the bill. And again, if there's a way to improve it, but then we should look at that. But it's important we do have a date in the past as